Egypt is a country in North Africa, on the Mediterranean Sea, and is home to one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. The name Egypt comes from the Greek Aegyptos, which was the Greek pronunciation of the ancient Egyptian name H. To the ancient Egyptians themselves, their country was simply known as Kemet, which means black land, so named for the rich, dark soil along the Nile River where the first settlements began. Later, the country was known as Misr, which means country, a name still in use by Egyptians for their nation in the present day. Egypt thrived for thousands of years as an independent nation whose culture was famous for great cultural advances in every area of human knowledge. Evidence of overgrazing of cattle on the land, which is now the Sahara Desert, has been dated to about 8000 BC. This evidence, along with artifacts discovered, points to a thriving agricultural civilization in the region at that time, as the land was mostly arid. Even then, hunter-gatherer nomads sought the cool of the water source of the Nile River Valley, and began to settle there sometime prior to 6000 BCE. From the arts to science to technology and religion, industry developed at about this same time, as evidenced by workshops discovered at Abydos dating to c. 5500 BCE. The Badarian were followed by the Gurzian and the Naqada cultures, all of which contributed significantly to the development of what became Egyptian civilization. The written history of the land begins at some point between 3400 and 3200 BCE, when hieroglyphic script is developed by the Naqada culture 3. By 3500 BC, mummification of the dead was in practice at the city of Hierakonpolis, and large stone tombs built at the city of Juar is recorded as being already ancient by 3100-2181 BCE, as inscribed on the famous Palermo stone. As in other cultures worldwide, the small agrarian communities became centralized and grew into larger urban centers. The great monuments, which ancient Egypt is still celebrated for, reflect the depth and grandeur of Egyptian culture, which influenced so many ancient civilizations, among them Greece and Rome, originally the name of the city of Memphis. Their great monuments, tombs, temples, and artwork all celebrate life and stand as reminders of what once was and what human beings, at their best, are capable of achieving. Although ancient Egypt in popular culture is often associated with death and mortuary rites, something even in these speaks to people across the ages of what it means to be a human being and the power and purpose of remembrance. Memphis was the first capital of Egypt and a famous religious and trade center. Its high status is attested to by the Greeks, alluding to the entire country by that name. The soul was immortal, and was only inhabiting a body on this physical plane for a short time. At death, one would meet with judgment in the hall of truth, and, if justified, would move on to an eternal paradise known as the Field of Reeds, which was a mirror image of one's life on earth. Once one had reached paradise, one could live peacefully in the company of those one had loved, while on earth, including one's pets, in the same neighborhood by the same stream beneath the very same trees, one thought had been lost at death. This eternal life, however, was only available to those who had lived well and in accordance with the will of the gods in the most perfect place conducive to such a goal, the land of Egypt. One of the reasons for the enduring popularity of Egyptian culture is its emphasis on the grandeur of the human experience. To the Egyptians, life on earth was only one aspect of an eternal journey. Egypt has a long history which goes back far beyond the written word. The stories of the gods, or the monuments which have made the culture famous, organized farming began in the region c. 6000 BCE, and communities known as the Badarian culture began to flourish alongside the river. The early dynastic period in Egypt saw the unification of the North and South kingdoms under the king Menes of Upper Egypt, who conquered Lower Egypt in c. 3118 BCE or c. 3150 BCE, and it is now thought that the man referred to by Manetho as Menes was the king Narmer who peacefully united Upper and Lower Egypt under one rule. Identification of Menes with Narmer is far from universally accepted. However, and Menes has been as credibly linked to the king Horaha who succeeded him. An explanation for Menes' association with his predecessor and successor is that Menes is an honorific title meaning he who endures and not a personal name, and so could have been used to refer to more than one king. The claim that the land was unified by military campaign is also disputed, as the famous Narmer palette, depicting a military victory, is considered by some scholars to be royal propaganda. The country may have first been united peacefully, but this seems unlikely. This version of the early history comes from the Egypt by the ancient historian Manetho, who lived in the 3rd century BCE under the Ptolemaic dynasty. Although his chronology has been disputed by later historians, it is still regularly consulted on dynastic succession and the early history of ancient Egypt. Manetho's work is the only source which cites Menes, and the conquest geographical designation in ancient Egypt follows the direction of the Nile River, and so Upper Egypt is the southern region and Lower Egypt the northern area closer to the Mediterranean Sea. Narmer ruled from the city of Erechinopolis and then from Memphis and Abot. Trade increased significantly under the rulers of the early dynastic period in Egypt, and elaborate mastaba tombs, precursors to the later pyramids, developed in Egyptian burial practices which included increasingly elaborate mummification techniques. From the pre-dynastic period in Egypt, a belief in the gods defined the Egyptian culture. An early Egyptian creation myth tells of the god Atum who stood in the midst of swirling chaos before the beginning of time and spoke creation into existence. The sun rose and set as it did, and the moon traveled its course across the sky, and the seasons came and went in accordance with balance and order, which was possible because of these two agencies. Mat was also personified as a deity, the goddess of the ostrich feather, to whom every king promised his full abilities and devotion. The king was associated with the god Horus in life and Osiris in death, based upon a myth which became the most popular in Egyptian history. Atum was accompanied by the eternal force of Hek, personified in the god Heka, and by other spiritual forces which would animate the world. Heka was the primal force which infused the universe and caused all things to operate as they did. It also allowed for the central value of the Egyptian culture, mort, harmony, and balance. All of the gods and all of their responsibilities went back to Mahat and Hek. Osiris and his sister wife Isis were the original monarchs who governed the world and gave the people the gifts of civilization. Osiris' brother, Set, grew jealous of him and murdered him, but he was brought back to life by Isis, who then bore his son Horus. Osiris was incomplete, however, and so descended to rule the underworld, while Horus, once he had matured, avenged his father and defeated Set. This myth illustrated how order triumphed over chaos and would become a persistent motif in Egyptian religion, mortuary rituals, and religious texts and art. There was no period in which the gods did not play an integral role in the daily lives of the Egyptians. Is clearly seen from the earliest times in the country's history. During the period known as the Old Kingdom of Egypt, architecture honoring the gods developed at an increased rate, and some of the most famous monuments in Egypt, such as the pyramids and the Great Sphinx of Giza, were constructed. The king Djoser, who reigned c. 2670 BCE, built the first step pyramid, at Saqqara Sea. Most reputable scholars today reject the claim that the pyramids and other monuments were built by slave labor. Although slaves of different nationalities certainly did exist in Egypt and were employed regularly in the mines, Egyptian monuments were considered public works created for the state and used both skilled and unskilled Egyptian workers in construction, all of whom were paid for their labor. Workers at the Giza site, which was only one of many, were given a ration of beer 3 times a day, and their housing, tools, and even their level of health care have all been clearly established. 2670, designed by his chief architect and physician, who also wrote one of the first medical texts describing the treatment of over 200 different diseases and arguing that the cause of disease could be natural, not the will of the gods. The Great Pyramid of Khufu was constructed during his reign, with the pyramids of Amenkaure following. The grandeur of the pyramids on the Giza Plateau, as they originally would have appeared, sheathed in gleaming white limestone, is a testament to the power and wealth of the rulers during this period. Many theories abound regarding how these monuments and tombs were constructed, but modern architects and scholars are far from agreement on any single one. Considering the technology of the day, some have argued a monument such as the Great Pyramid of Giza should not exist. Others claim, however, that the existence of such buildings and tombs suggests superior technology which has been lost to time. There is absolutely no evidence that the monuments of the Giza Plateau, or any others in Egypt, were built by slave labor, nor is there any evidence to support a historical reading of the biblical Book of Exodus. The era known as the First Intermediate Period of Egypt saw a decline in the power of the central government following its collapse. Largely independent districts with their own governors developed throughout Egypt until 2 great centers emerged: Hierakonpolis in Lower Egypt and Thebes in Upper Egypt. These centers founded their own dynasties, which ruled their regions independently and intermittently fought with each other for supreme control until c. While the names of the Hyksos kings are Semitic in origin, no definite ethnicity has been established for them. While the Hyksos were hated by the Egyptians, they introduced a great many improvements to the culture, such as the composite bow, the horse, and the chariot, along with crop rotation and developments in bronze and ceramic works. At the same time, the Hyksos controlled the ports of Lower Egypt. By 1700 BCE, the kingdom of Kush had risen to the south of Thebes, in Nubia, and now held that border. The Egyptians mounted a number of campaigns to drive the Hyksos out and subdue the Nubians, but all failed until Prince Ahmose I of Thebes succeeded and unified the country. Under Theban rule, the Hyksos grew in power until they were able to take control of a significant portion of Lower Egypt by c. 1720 BC, rendering the Theban dynasty of Upper Egypt almost a vassal state. 2040 BCE, when the Theban king Mentuhotep II defeated the forces of Hierakonpolis and united Egypt under the rule of Thebes. The stability provided by Theban rule allowed for the flourishing of what is known as the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom is considered Egypt's classical age, when art and culture reached great heights, and Thebes became the most important and wealthiest city in the country. According to the historians Oakes and Gott, the 12th dynasty kings were strong rulers who established control not only over the whole of Egypt, but also over Nubia to the south, where several fortresses were built to protect Egyptian trading interests. The first standing army was created during the Middle Kingdom by the king Amenhotep. The Temple of Karnak was begun under Sit, and some of the greatest and Egyptian literature and art was produced. The 13th dynasty, however, was weaker than the 12th and distracted by internal problems, which allowed for a foreign people known as the Hyksos to gain power in Lower Egypt around the Nile Delta. The Hyksos are a mysterious people, most likely from the area of Syria-Palestine, who first appeared in Egypt, c. 1800, and settled in the town of Av. This era is known as the Second Intermediate Period of Egypt. Moses initiated what is known as the period of the New Kingdom of Egypt, which again saw great prosperity in the land under a strong central government. His reign was followed by Queen Hatshepsut, who greatly expanded trade with other nations, most notably the land of Punt. Her 22-year reign was one of peace and prosperity for Egypt. The title of Pharaoh for the ruler of Egypt comes from the period of the New Kingdom. Earlier monarchs were simply known as kings. The Egyptians, as noted above, traditionally believed in many gods whose importance influenced every aspect of their daily lives. Among the most popular of these deities were Amun, Osiris, Isis, and Hathor. The cult of Amun, at this time, had grown so wealthy that the priests were almost as powerful as the pharaoh. Akhenaten and his queen, Nefertiti, renounced the traditional religious beliefs and customs of Egypt and instituted a new religion based upon the recognition of one god, who commenced the most elaborate building projects of any Egyptian ruler. And the smaller temple at the site, following Akhenaten's example, is dedicated to Ramesses' favorite queen Nefertiti. Under the reign of Ramesses II, the first peace treaty in the world in time, all of his subjects had been born knowing only Ramesses II as their ruler and had no memory of another. He enjoyed an exceptionally long life of 96 years, over double the average lifespan of an ancient Egyptian. Upon his death, it is recorded that many feared the end of the world had come, as they had known no other pharaoh and no other kind of Egypt. Was signed in 1258 BCE, and Egypt enjoyed almost unprecedented affluence, as evidenced by the number of monuments built or restored during his reign, and who reigned so efficiently that he had the means to do so. Although the famous Battle of Kadesh of 1274 BC is today regarded as a draw, Ramesses considered it a great Egyptian victory and celebrated himself as a champion of the people and finally as a god. In his many public works, he did not want her to serve as a role model for other women, since only males were considered worthy to rule. And by the time of his death in 1425 BCE, Egypt was a great and powerful nation. He moved the capital from Thebes to Amarna to further distance his rule from that of his predecessors. It is largely due to Kamweset's initiative that Ramesses II's name is so prominent at so many ancient sites in Egypt. Kamweset left a record of his own efforts. The original builder, owner of the monument or temple, and his father's name as well. Akhenaten was the first ruler to decree statuary and a temple in honor of his queen instead of only for himself or the gods, and used the money which once went to the temples for public works and parks. The power of the clergy declined sharply as that of the central government grew, which seemed to be Akhenaten's goal, but he failed to use his power for the best interest of his people. The Amarna letters make clear that he was more concerned with his religious reforms than with foreign policy, or the needs of the people of Egypt. This is known as the Amarna period, during which Amarna grew as the capital of the country and polytheistic religious customs were banned. He was originally named Tutankhaten to reflect the religious beliefs of his father, but upon assuming the throne, changed his name to Tutankhamun to honor the ancient god. Amen. He restored the ancient temples, removed all references to his father's single deity, and returned the capital to Thebes. His reign was cut short by his death, and today he is most famous for the intact grandeur of his tomb, discovered in 1922 CE, which became an international sensation at the time. At this time, however, more elaborate baths were produced, presumably more for leisure than simply hygiene. The Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, concerning women's health and contraceptives, had been written c. 1800 BCE, and, during this period, seems to have been made extensive use of by doctors. Surgery and dentistry were both practiced widely and with great skill, and beer was prescribed by physicians for ease of symptoms of over 200 different maladies. The prosperity led to, among other things, an increase in the brewing of beer in many different varieties and more leisure time for sports. Advances in medicine led to improvements in health. Many of the Egyptian sovereigns best known today ruled during this period, and the majority of the great structures of Egyptian architecture, such as the Ramesseum, Abu Simbel, the temples of Karnak and Luxor, and the tombs of the Valley of the Kings and Valley of the Queens, were either created or greatly enhanced during this time. Between 1504 to 1492 BCE, consolidated his power and expanded the boundaries of Egypt to the Euphrates River in the north, Syria and Palestine to the west, and Nubia to the south. Her successor Thutmose III carried on her policies, although he tried to eradicate all memory of her as it is. Thought bathing had long been an important part of the daily Egyptian regimen, as it was encouraged by their religion and modelled by their clergy. In 1353 BCE, the pharaoh Amenhotep IV succeeded to the throne and, shortly after, changed his name to Akhenaten to reflect his belief in a single god. Aton, his religious reforms effectively cut the power of the priests of Aman and placed it in his hands. Among his many accomplishments, his reign was followed by his son, the most recognizable Egyptian ruler in the modern day, Tutankhamun, who reigned from c. 1336 to c. 1327 BCE. The greatest ruler of the new kingdom, however, was Ramesses II. His temple of Abu Simbel depicts the Battle of Kadesh. Ramesses II's fourth son, Kamwis, is known as the first Egyptologist for his efforts in preserving and recording old monuments, temples, and their original owners' names. Ramesses II became known to later generations as the Great Ancestor, and reigned for so long that he outlived most of his children and his wives. One of his successors, Ramesses III, followed his policies, but, by this time, Egypt's great wealth had attracted the attention of the Sea Peoples, who began to make regular incursions along the coast. The Sea Peoples, like the Hyksos, are of unknown origin, but are thought to have come from the southern Aegean area. Between 1276 to 1178 BCE, the Sea Peoples were a threat to Egyptian security. Ramesses II had defeated them in a naval battle early in his reign, as had his successor after Maremta's death. However, they increased their efforts, sacking Kadesh, which was then under Egyptian control, and ravaging the coast. Between 1180 to 1178 BCE, Ramesses III fought them off, finally defeating them at the Battle of Juar in 1178 BC. The Egyptian Empire rose during the period of the New Kingdom, when the country reached its height of wealth, international prestige, and military might. The empire stretched from modern-day Syria in the north to modern-day Sudan in the south, from the region of Jordan in the east to Libya in the west. Since the empire rose and fell in the course of the New Kingdom, historians refer to the period as either the New Kingdom or the Egyptian Empire interchangeably. Egyptian history is divided by later scholars into eras of kingdoms and intermediate periods. Kingdoms were times of a strong central government and a unified nation, while intermediate periods were eras of a weak central government and disunity. The New Kingdom emerged from the time known as the Second Intermediate. In his early campaigns, Ahmose created buffer states around Egypt's borders to prevent any other foreign power from gaining a foothold in the country as the Hyksos had, and Ramesses III all reigned during this time, and some of the most famous monuments and temples, such as the Colossi of Memnon and the Temple of Amun at Karnak, were built. In doing so, he initiated the policy of conquest, which would be followed by his successors and give rise to the Empire of Egypt. Loss of faith in the traditional role of the king, increased power of the priesthood, and a decline in its international prestige all contributed to its fall. In its time, however, it was among the most powerful and prestigious empires of the ancient world, in which the country was divided between a foreign, Semitic people known as the Hyksos holding power in northern Lower Egypt, the Nubians ruling to the south in Upper Egypt, and the city of Thebes in the middle, representing the traditional Egyptian government. The Theban king Ahmose I drove the Hyksos out of Egypt and defeated the Nubians, uniting Egypt under his rule from Thebes. This period is the most famous in Egyptian history. Egypt's best-known monarchs, such as Hatshepsut Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Ramesses II. The empire flourished through the reign of Ramesses III, when invasions, overspending which depleted the treasury, corruption of government officials. The Middle Kingdom, during the 12th dynasty, is considered Egypt's golden age, when cultural and artistic achievements reached their height. During the 13th dynasty, however, the kings were weaker and more concerned with their own pursuits and court intrigues than the good of the country. During this time, the Hyksos were able to establish themselves at Avaris in Lower Egypt and steadily consolidated their presence until they were able to wield significant political and military power. Trade connections between the Hyksos in the north, the Nubians in the south, and Thebes were well established, and the only evidence of the Hyksos destroying temples or sacking cities comes long after their arrival in the land and is thought to have been provoked by individual cities of Lower Egypt or by It is also a myth that the Hyksos ruled all of Lower Egypt. Their power was limited to just below the Delta region. The Middle Kingdom fell as the Egyptian central government grew weaker, and both the Hyksos in the north and the Nubians in the south grew stronger. Initiating the Second Intermediate Period, later scribes of the New Kingdom would characterize the time of the Hyksos as an invasion, and other writers, picking up on this, perpetuated that myth. The Hyksos never invaded Egypt. However, they were initially traders who saw an opportunity to establish themselves in a neglected region of Egypt and took it. Contrary to later reports, the Hyksos were not enemies of Egypt who rampaged through the country, burning and looting the temples. The Theban king Sek interpreted a message from the Hyksos king Apapi, which was probably a request to curtail the Theban practice of hippo hunting as a challenge to his authority, and launched a campaign against the town of Ab. Tao was killed in battle, but his cause was taken up by his son, Komos, and then by Amos, the first who defeated the Hyksos and unified Egypt. There is ample evidence, rather, that the Hyksos admired Egyptian culture and emulated the Egyptians in many ways. Trade went on evenly between the Hyksos, Egyptians, and Nubians until the government at Thebes grew tired of feeling like guests in their own country. Ahmose I conquered Avaris, drove the Hyksos survivors into the Levant, and then pursued them up through Syria. In doing so, he naturally conquered those regions for Egypt and installed his own officials to govern them. This was the beginning of the Egyptian Empire. Ahmose I established the policy of creating buffer states around Egypt's borders so that an invasion such as that of the Hyksos would never be possible again. After defeating the Hyksos, Ahmose I marched south and drove the Nubians back beyond the traditional borders, thus enlarging Egypt's territory in three directions: south, east, and north, which included the profitable region of the Levant. Although the Hyksos were later vilified, they improved Egyptian culture in a number of ways, and significantly improved their weaponry. Prior to the arrival of the Hyksos, the Egyptians had no knowledge of the horse or horse-drawn chariot. They were still using the single-arched bow, and were equipped with swords which were not always reliable, and with more expensive blades, ornamented. This curved sword was much more effective than any the Egyptians had used in the past. The war chariot, manned by archers with the new composite bow and a large quiver attached to the side, would prove one of Egypt's most significant military assets, and the battle axe, made of bronze, attached to a haft, was far more effective than the flint or copper axes bound to wooden shafts used in the past. These would be the weapons of the new Kingdom Empire, and would be used by a new kind of military. Egyptologist Barbara Watterson comments on Hyksos, being from Western Asia, brought the Egyptians into contact with the peoples and the culture of that region as never before, and introduced them to the horse-drawn war chariot, to a composite bow made from wood reinforced with strips of sinew and horn, a more elastic weapon with a greater range than their own simple bow, to a scimitar-shaped sword called the koppish, and to a bronze dagger with a narrow blade cast in one piece with the tempes. The Egyptians developed this weapon into a short sword. The koppish sword was cast entirely of bronze, and the handle was then wound with hide and cloth. The first standing army in Egypt was established by Amenhotep, the first of the 12th dynasty in the Middle Kingdom. Prior to this time, the army was comprised of conscripts sent to the king by regional governors from their districts, who were often more loyal to their home ruler and region than the king of the country. These early armies marched under their own banners and elevated their regional cult gods. Amenhotep I cut the power of the nomarchs by creating a professional army, with a chain of command that placed power in the king's hands and was overseen by his vizier. The army Ahmose I, mobilized against the Hyksos, was made up of professionals, conscripts, and mercenaries like the Medjay warriors, but under the reign of his son, Amenhotep, this army would be extensively trained and further equipped with the best weapons available at the time. Egyptologist Helen Strudwick notes, by the New Kingdom, the Egyptian army had begun to adopt the superior weapons and equipment of their enemies, the Syrians and Hittites. The triangular bow, the helmet, chainmail tunics, and the koppish sword became standard issue. Equally, the quality of the bronze improved as the Egyptians experimented with different proportions of tin and copper. Not only were the weapons of the army new and improved, but so was the structure of the military itself. Between the time of Amenhotep I and Ahmose I, the military had remained more or less the same. Weaponry and military training had improved, but not dramatically, under the reign of Amenhotep I, though this would change as Egyptologist Margaret Bunson explains. The army was no longer a confederation of nome levies, but a first-class military force, organized into divisions, both chariot forces and infantry. Each division numbered approximately 5,000 men. These divisions carried the names of the principal deities of the nation. Unlike the early army, which went to battle under the banners of their nomes and clans, the New Kingdom army fought for the welfare of the entire country, bearing the standards of the universal gods of Egypt. The king was the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, with his vizier and subordinates handling the logistics and supply lines. The chariot divisions, in which the pharaoh rode, were directly under his command and divided into squadrons with their own captain. There were also mercenary forces, like the Medjay, who served as shock troops. These were the troops who forged and then maintained the Egyptian empire. Amenhotep I continued the policies of Ahmose I, and each pharaoh who came after him did the same. She broke with the tradition of a patriarchal monarchy with no evidence of rebellion on the part of her subjects or the court, and established a reign which enriched Egypt financially and culturally without engaging in any extensive military campaigns. He would have done this in order to maintain the tradition of a male sovereign. Not because he had anything against the queen and he left her name intact inside her mortuary temple and elsewhere out of the public eye. By the time of the reign of Amenhotep III, Egypt was among the wealthiest and most powerful in the world. Amenhotep III was a brilliant administrator and diplomat, whose prosperous reign established Egypt firmly in what historians refer to as the Club of the Great Powers, which included Babylonia, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Land of the Hatti, all of whom were joined in peaceful relations through trade and diplomacy. Even so, later kings knew nothing of her accomplishments, and she would not be known to history again for over 2,000 years. The temples in all the cities and towns were closed and religious festivals abolished except those venerating his god. The Egyptian economy relied heavily on religious practices, as the temples were the centers of the community and employed a large staff. The Egyptian army at this time was formidable and alliances were quick to be made. The central cultural value of Egypt, which was the foundation of the religion and the society, was ignored by Akhenaten's administration, and so were the diplomatic and commercial ties with other powers. Ramesses II is not only the best-known pharaoh in the present day, but also in antiquity, thanks to his talent for self-promotion and the skills of his vizier, who ensured that the king's name would endure through monuments, temples, and towering statuary honoring him. Although Akhenaten is frequently depicted by modern-day writers as a great religious visionary and an exceptional king, he was actually neither. He re-established ties with the other great powers, signed the first peace treaty in the world with the Hittites, following the Battle of Kadesh. And although he had himself depicted regularly as a great warrior king, concentrated most of his reign on domestic policies, trade and diplomacy. Thutmose III was actually the most skilled military leader of the new kingdom, not Ramesses II, but the image of the pharaoh as a mighty warrior was a long-established tradition. Egypt symbolizing the king's powers. Even if a particular monarch was actually more skilled in other areas, his work was completed by who erased Akhenaten's name from history and destroyed his city. Horemheb succeeded in restoring Egypt, but it was nowhere near the strength it had been prior to Akhenaten's reign. His religious reforms were most likely a political maneuver to decrease the power of the cult of Amun, which by his time was almost as powerful as the king, and his attention to rule was so minimal that his wife Nefertiti took over administrative duties and correspondence with other nations. Wealth flowed into the royal treasury from beyond Egypt's borders, and Amenhotep III could afford to pay large crews of workers to erect his temples and monuments. Since they were tax-exempt, all the produce from their lands went to them directly, not to the government, and so they were able to amass considerable wealth. From the Old Kingdom on, the cult only grew in power, and so it is probable that Akhenaten's reforms were motivated far more by politics and greed than any divine vision of a one true God. He built so many of these, in fact, that later historians thought he must have ruled for over 100 years to have accomplished all he had. In reality, he was simply an exceptionally able statesman. Thutmose put down rebellions in Nubia and expanded Egypt's territories in the Levant and Syria. She re-established contact with the land of Punt, an almost mythical land of riches, which supplied Egypt with many of the luxury goods the upper classes came to covet, as well as necessary items for the worship of the gods and the cosmetics industry. Historians have often referred to him as the Napoleon of Egypt for his success in battle, as he fought 17 campaigns in 20 years, and unlike Napoleon, he was victorious in all of them. He also encouraged an extended trade, and was a man of culture who helped preserve Egypt's history. Nubia was especially prized by the Egyptians for their gold mines. In fact, the region took its name from the Egyptian word for gold nub. Little is known of his successor, Thutmose II, because his reign is overshadowed by the impressive era of Queen Hatshepsut is not only the most successful female ruler in Egypt's history, but among the most remarkable leaders of the ancient world. Although there is evidence that she commissioned military expeditions early in her reign, the remainder was peaceful and focused on Egypt's infrastructure, building projects, and trade. When Hatshepsut died, she was succeeded by Thutmose III who, possibly in an effort to prevent future women from emulating her, had Hatshepsut's name erased from monuments. Thutmose III should not be remembered for this one action. However, as he proved himself an able and efficient ruler and a brilliant military leader, the foreign and domestic policies of Thutmose III enriched Egypt and expanded its borders, providing the country with a stable economy and a growing international reputation. Foreign kings wrote regularly to Amenhotep III asking for gold and favors, which he freely granted, and countries were eager to trade with Egypt because of its vast resources and considerable strength. Amenhotep III's son and successor was Amenhotep IV, who, in the 4th or 5th year of his reign, changed his name to Ak and abolished the traditional religious practices of Egypt. The friction between the cult of Amen and royalty started during the period of the Old Kingdom, when the kings of the 4th dynasty elevated the sect and gave them tax-exempt status in exchange for performing the necessary mortuary rituals at the Giza complex. Under the reign of Akhenaten, the capital was moved from Thebes to a new city, Akhetaten, designed and built by the king and dedicated to his personal god. Further, craftspeople who made statuary, amulets, and other religious artifacts were also put out of work. Akhenaten's successor was Tutankhamun, who was in the process of restoring Egypt to its former status when he died young. During the 19th dynasty, which followed, the most famous pharaoh in Egypt's history would claim to have finally restored the country to power, Ramesses II. Ramesses II may not have completely brought Egypt back to the level of power it had known Amenhotep III, but he certainly came close. The 19th dynasty continued the successes of the 18th. During the 20th dynasty, the empire began to decline. Ramesses II and his successor, in keeping with the Egyptian practice of elevating the numbers of enemies slain in battle while minimizing their own losses, official records only record the glorious victories of the defense of Egypt. Evidence of problems arising afterwards, however, indicates that a loss of labor resulted in less grain production and a struggling economy. The cost of the war had also depleted the treasury, and trade relations with other powers were suffering. Egypt did not have the kinds of resources as before. The problems which would lead to the rapid decline of the empire manifested themselves only toward the end of his reign. After his reign, the country entered what is known as the Ramessid period, when Ramesses IV through Ramesses XI presided over the steady decline of the empire. Also, these other powers were dealing with their own difficulties resulting from raids by the Sea Peoples and others. Trade with other countries became more difficult, the army was allowed to stagnate, and Egypt's international standing became a memory. At the height of the empire, this task would have posed no problems. But, the author makes clear, once Egypt had lost its balance, the time of Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, and Ramesses II was over, and Egypt's later periods would see few kings like them and know nothing like the grandeur of the Egyptian empire. And fallen in status with other powers, even the simplest undertaking could become an ordeal. When a man is robbed, insulted, ignored, and even resorts to robbery himself. The poor economy encouraged tomb robbing and widespread corruption among police, magistrates, and government officials who no longer respected the social hierarchy or the religious and cultural values which had sustained Egypt for so long. Morant had both defeated invasions by the Sea Peoples, a coalition of different tribes, who were responsible for weakening and destroying a number of civilizations at this time, but had not crippled their power. This kind of question would have been unthinkable at the height of the Egyptian Empire. The country was, by this time, divided between rule by the pharaoh in Lower Egypt and by the high priest of Amun at Thebes in Upper Egypt. Ramesses XI's successor, Smenz, would attempt to reign like the pharaohs of the past, but, in reality, was a coroller with the high priest Herihor of Thebes. At the beginning of the era known as the Third Intermediate Period, as the priests of Amun became more powerful and the king became weaker, the monarch came to matter less and less to the people. The high priest at Thebes was increasingly given as much, if not more, respect than the king, thus weakening the monarchy. The empire's problems were clearly manifested in the workers' strike of 1159 BCE at Deir el-Medina, the first recorded strike in the world, when the wages for the tomb builders were late, and the local officials were helpless in rectifying the problem. In the 20th dynasty, under the reign of Ramesses III, the Sea Peoples returned in force, and the king had no choice but to mobilize his army and mount a defense. Ramesses III defeated the Sea Peoples just as his predecessors had, but the cost in lives and resources was tremendous. At this same time, the cult of Amun was again as powerful as it had been prior to Akhenaten's attempt to destroy it. One report from the time cites an official telling the workers that he would give them their grain if he had any, but there was nothing he could do. Officials also had no idea how to handle the strike itself. Nothing like it had ever happened before. And so they more or less did nothing. The underlying problem was that the concept of harmony, embodied in Ma'at, had been ignored, and the king was no longer able to keep the balance required to govern effectively. Ramesses III was the last good pharaoh of the new kingdom. By the time of Ramesses, respect for the pharaoh was at an all-time low as the economy floundered. A letter from a general during the reign of Ramesses XI exemplifies how fragmented Egyptian society had become by this time, when he asks, "As for Pharaoh, whose superior is he after all?" The 20th dynasty and the Egyptian Empire ended with the death of Ramesses. The Egyptian literary work, the Report of Weneman, is set during this period and describes the difficulties of an official who is sent on a mission to the Levant to buy wood for the restoration of the bark of Amun. Like the letter questioning the king's value, the events depicted in the Report of Weneman would have been unimaginable during the golden days of Egypt's empire. Ancient Egypt is defined as the civilization which flourished in North Africa between c. 6000 to 30 BCE. From the pre-dynastic period in Egypt, the central value of Egyptian culture was balance, personified by the goddess Ma'at, and this encouraged a stable social platform from which people could explore the world and advance their understanding of how to live in it, and further what waited in the afterlife, beyond death. Through the Ptolemaic dynasty, before Egypt became a province of Rome, Roman Egypt afterwards fell to the invasions of the Muslim Arabs. For thousands of years, the civilization of Egypt was among the most significant in the ancient world, and its kings were considered the living representatives of the divine on earth. The ancient Egyptians developed a highly sophisticated culture, which made significant advances in medical practices and procedures, architectural and construction innovations, the development of literary motifs in poetry and prose, religious belief and tradition, and a vision of the afterlife which was grander and more comforting than any other of its time. The following are 10 facts about Egypt, in answer to the most commonly asked questions. What is the difference between kingdom periods and intermediate periods? The ancient Egyptians had no demarcations between eras of their civilization. The dates differ sometimes, owing to the system scholars choose to use, but the generally accepted dates are 3150 BCE. Events were dated from the rule of kings or memorable events, whether natural, such as floods, bad harvests, especially good harvests, or signs attributed to the gods, or historical, such as great military victories, or building projects. Designations such as kingdoms and intermediate periods come from scholars in the modern day, in an effort to make it easier to study the immense breadth of Egyptian civilization. The history of ancient Egypt is therefore broken into different eras. Pre-dynastic period, c. 6000, c. Early dynastic period, c. 3150, c. 2613 BCE. Kingdom, c. 2181 BC. First intermediate period, 2181 to 2040 BCE. Middle Kingdom, 2040 to 1782 BCE. Second intermediate period, c. 1782, c. 1570 BCE. During the kingdoms, there was a monarch governing from a central location. The economy and society was stable, and there was discernible cultural progress. During the intermediate periods, Egyptian government was divided between locations. There was less stability, and physical evidence shows fewer cultural advances. Even so, the intermediate periods were nowhere near as chaotic as the scholars of the 19th-20th centuries CE interpreted them. New Kingdom, c. 1572, c. 1069 BCE. Third intermediate period, c. 1069 to 525 BC. Late period of ancient Egypt, 525 to 323 BCE. Ptolemaic period, 32330 BCE. The difference between kingdoms and intermediate periods has to do with the centralization of rule. Who was the pharaoh of the Book of Exodus? The most commonly cited Egyptian king for the unnamed pharaoh of Exodus is Ra, and the second most cited is Ok. Although various writers through the years have claimed many others, there is actually no historical, textual, or physical evidence that the Hebrews were enslaved in Egypt at any time in any great numbers. There is ample evidence that the people who built the pyramids and other great monuments of Egypt were Egyptians who were either skilled workers or unskilled, laborers who were expected to devote time to community service, such as public building projects, at the times when the Nile River flooded and farming was impossible. In spite of the claims of many through the years, the Exodus story is a cultural myth, and there was no actual pharaoh who enslaved the Israelites because they were never enslaved en masse in Egypt. Slaves were taken from various lands after military victories, or in sale by traders, and were primarily used in the mines and by royalty. There may have been Hebrew slaves among these, but not in the numbers given in the biblical narrative. What was the Egyptian army like, and how was it organized? In the period of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, the army was made up of conscripts from various districts under the leadership of a regional governor. Each division had an officer who oversaw 50 soldiers and reported to a superior in charge of 250 who, in turn, reported to a captain who was under a troop commander. Even during the rise of the Egyptian Empire, the armies were used to create and then maintain a buffer zone around Egypt to prevent invasion, but never went further than it needed to in order to maintain order. Part of the reason for this was the Egyptian religion, and the belief that if one died outside of Egypt's borders, one's soul would have a harder time reaching the paradise of the field of reeds. The troop commander was responsible to the troop overseer, who reported to the fortification overseer, who was under a lieutenant commander, who reported to a general. The general was directly under the supervision of the Egyptian vizier, who reported to the pharaoh. The nomarch organized his men and sent the company to the king. During the first intermediate period of Egypt, this system broke down, as each individual Namak gained greater power with the fall of the central government, and used their militia to pursue their own agenda. In the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, the king Amenhotep I created the first standing army. The military was improved upon during the second intermediate period of Egypt, through contributions from the Hyksos, such as the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, the scimitar sword, and bronze dagger. By the time of the New Kingdom of Egypt, the Egyptian army was a highly trained, professional fighting force, which helped to create and maintain the Egyptian empire. The army was organized into divisions, which were each named for a principal deity, and were comprised of approximately 5,000 men. Egyptian warfare was never aimed at conquest, but rather defense and stability. Why did the Egyptians mummify their dead? The Egyptians believed the soul was constituted of 9 separate parts. Khat was the physical body. Ka was one's double form. Ba was a human-headed bird aspect which could speed between earth and the heavens. Shuyet was the shadow self. Ak was the immortal, transformed self. Sahu and Sekhem were aspects of the oak. Ab was the heart, the source of good and evil. Ren was one's secret name. The physical body needed to be preserved so the Ka and Ba could recognize itself, and the Osi could continue on to the field of reeds. In Egyptian burial rites, grave goods were included in the tomb of the deceased, so they could be used in the afterlife, and these would only be of value if the body remained intact. Contrary to popular belief, the Egyptians were not obsessed with death. They enjoyed life so much they never wanted it to end, and this encouraged the belief in an eternal realm where one would live forever, enjoying all one did in life in the presence of the gods. Is there any truth to the curse of Tutankhamun? The curse of the pharaohs? There is no truth to the famous curse of the pharaohs, which gained notoriety after the archaeologist Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in November of 1922 CE, and Corelli's letter, which was popularized by the press, had exactly the effect he would have wished for in scaring people away. Carter could proceed with the excavation and examination of the tomb without further distraction, and so never contradicted Corelli's claim. Even though there was never any evidence she owned any ancient text and no evidence of any curse, Hollywood movies would further popularize the mummy's curse and embed it in the collective consciousness of the modern day. Of the 58 people present when the tomb and sarcophagus were opened, only 8 died within the next 12 years, and all of quite reasonable and rational causes, having nothing to do with the tomb. The myth of the curse of Tutankhamun began in 1923 CE, when the best-selling writer Marie sent a letter to the magazine New York, while quoting from an ancient text she claimed to own, which warned of terrible consequences for any who disturbed the tombs of the kings of Egypt. Corelli was a popular novelist at the time, and her letter received a great deal of attention. Howard Carter, at this same time, was increasingly frustrated by the many visitors interfering with his work at Tutankhamun's tomb. What food did the Egyptians eat? The Egyptian diet was mainly vegetarian. Meat could not be stored, as the Egyptians had no refrigeration, and so was eaten shortly after slaughter at festivals, banquets, and by the upper class, who had the leisure to hunt large game. Wealthy Egyptians enjoyed coconuts, which were among the most popular imported luxury goods. Cows, goats, and sheep were raised for milk, which also provided cream, Kurds, and wild bulls were raised for manual labor on farms. The Egyptians also enjoyed a wide array of spices and oils, with their meals including sesame, flax seed, cinnamon, cumin, and the most popular, horseradish. Different foods were often prescribed by physicians as remedies, and, in Egyptian medicine, diet was recognized as a major factor in one's health. Poultry and fish were eaten by every social class. The staples of the Egyptian diet were bread and beer. Although wine was made, it was mainly the drink of the upper class. Beer was the most popular drink, consumed at every meal of the day, as it was considered healthier than drinking from the Nile or streams, which could be polluted, and was believed to promote a lighter spirit and contented heart. Workers' wages, in fact, included a ration of beer and bread. Vegetables and fruits made up most of the rest of the Egyptian diet, including onions, lentils, leeks, garlic, olives, pomegranate, grapes, dates, and figs. What was daily life like in ancient Egypt? Egyptian society was based on a hierarchy which descended down, from highest to lowest. King and royal family, vizier, members of the court, priests and scribes, regional governors, military leaders, artisans and craftspeople, workplace supervisors, unskilled workers and farmer slaves. Social mobility was not encouraged, because it was thought that the social order been decreed by the gods in keeping with Mat, and so maintaining it was vital in keeping harmony and balance in the land. A farmer's day began at sunrise when he went to the fields and ended at dusk when they returned home for the evening meal. Trade was conducted through the barter system until c. 525 BC, when the coin system was introduced by the Persians. The monetary unit in place before that was the deban, which was a set value on a product. It was the king's responsibility to ensure Mat was upheld at every level, but, with very rare exceptions, everyone understood their place and behaved accordingly. The economy was based on agriculture, and most of the lower class were farmers. In their leisure time, the upper class hunted, played sports, fished, played board games, and watched sporting events, and, except for hunting big game, the lower class enjoyed these same pastimes as well as swimming and boating. The Egyptians enjoyed parties and festivals, and the various gods, birthdays, and other events were celebrated by national holidays when work was suspended, and everyone gathered to drink, eat, and dance. Were there any great female rulers besides Cleopatra? Although Cleopatra VII is arguably the most famous Egyptian queen, she was not actually Egyptian, but Greek, the last monarch of the Hellenistic Ptolemaic dynasty. There were many other great Egyptian queens throughout the nation's history. However, in the early dynastic period in Egypt, there was Nefertip of the first dynasty of Egypt, and Mernith. In the Old Kingdom, Queen Het was the mother of King Khufu and exercised considerable influence over him. One of the most controversial queens of this same period was Net, who is said to have avenged her brother's murder by inviting his killers to a banquet in an underground chamber and then drowning them. It should be noted, however, that scholars continue to debate the truth of this story and whether this queen even existed. In the Middle Kingdom, Queen Sobonefru reigned, and this period also saw the development of the honorary title of Goddess, Wife of Amon, which would elevate the women who later held it to influential positions. Queen Aho is the first known powerful woman to have held the title at the beginning of the New Kingdom, and she passed it to her daughter who would pass it on to others. Some of the greatest and best-known queens come from the New Kingdom period, such as Hattai Nefertiti, wife of Akhenaten, who took over his responsibilities when he neglected them for religious pursuits. There was also Nefertari, wife of an inspiration to Ramesses the Great, who is famously depicted at Abu Simbel. In the Third Intermediate period, Some of the most powerful women held the title of God's wife of Ammon, such as I, who ruled Upper Egypt. A later God's wife of Ammon ruled almost all of Egypt, and was the wealthiest of all the goddess wives in the history of the title. By the time Cleopatra VII took the throne, Egypt already had a long history of powerful women in positions of authority. What are some cultural legacies of ancient Egypt? Ancient Egypt contributed a number of inventions and innovations regularly used in the present day. The Egyptians placed a high value on personal hygiene, and so daily bathing, combs and brushes, makeup, and perfumes were all either invented or improved upon by them. Although engineers in the present day still do not understand how the Egyptians built, moved, and erected most of their great monuments, the structures inspired later cultures to emulate the forms. In agriculture, the Egyptians learned irrigation methods from the Hyksos, and improved upon the light and heavy-gauge oxtron plow. They also developed Babylonian concepts of astronomy and astrology, the calendar, and mathematics. They also invented the toothbrush and toothpaste, the breath mint, and deodorant in the form of incense. The religion and philosophy of the Egyptians has long been recognized as influencing Greek philosophy as well as later religions such as Christianity and Islam, especially through the concepts of eternal life, judgment after death, and rewards, punishments in the afterlife. Dentistry was also developed by the Egyptians, as was the physician's practice of taking a patient's history in diagnosing illness. Women, as well as men, were doctors, and some of the first clinics and medical schools in the world were established in Egypt. Egyptian architecture developed the true pyramid and the obelisk, as well as the techniques by which these were made and raised. Egyptian literature, especially of the Middle Kingdom, established the form of the romantic ballad and literary philosophical dialogue.